I began with a PhD in biochemistry. By the time I discovered it, I didn't really want to be a biochemist. I was too invested. So I finished it. Went on to do research for about a dozen years or so at the NIH, where I worked on cell and molecular biology, primarily of receptor-mediated endocytosis and cellular iron metabolism. Before I realized I didn't want to do that, I was too invested. I left, got an offer from a group of venture capitalists to move to Hayward, California. I had grown up in southern Ohio, which is what we call Trump country at this point. And I knew I needed to get out of there. So I moved to Baltimore, became a Baltimorean. And after living for most of my time on the East Coast, I got this offer from a group of venture capitalists to move to Hayward, California, and be involved in a startup biotech company, which at the time was called Ribogene. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been merged and fused and bought and one thing and another. But it was an interesting experience. Someone talked about moving over to the dark side yesterday of moving to administration, but the whole world of biotech is thought by many to be in that same category. While I was in California, a friend of mine whose name is Rick Klausner became the director of the NCI, and he kept calling me up saying, "You don't really like it out there, do you?" And I said, "Well, it's pretty nice. The weather's good." And eventually he prevailed on me to come back. And it's interesting because he said, what title should we give you? And I said, I don't really care. And so I said, well, why don't we come up with something that there's never been one of those before at the NCI? And I said, okay. So I became the Associate Director for Special Projects, which really had a ring to it, until I found out that the definition of a special project was something that was on fire or sinking like a stone. Okay, and one of the things that fell into that category was NCI's international program. So it sort of got moved onto my plate. The former director was spending a little too much time ruining his liver. And so the international program was floundering to an extent. And so I became the director of the Office of International Affairs. And that's when I became a closet epidemiologist and started interacting with folks who were doing international work. And I met Amr and Bob and others in the course of those international activities. I got the United Airlines million-mile flyer card out of the deal, and have come to realize that travel is overrated, especially now that the security systems have changed and one thing and another. I spend too much time holding up my hands and being x-rayed. So I decided to, I was also the chief of staff of the NCI, which the Office of the Director had about 400 employees at the time. I think it even has more now, but it was the finance office, the press office, all those sorts of things that aren't in any division, but fall within the Office of the Director. And so I had staff meetings with the leadership of all of those various far-flung offices. And then one of which was the Office of International Affairs. And when I'll digress to tell one Rick Klausner story, which is he had decided he was going to retire or resign as NCI director. And he said, Joe, what do you think the press is going to say about my resignation? And I said, well, Rick, it's going to depend on whether it's a slow news day or not. Which is that's the truth about everything that gets covered. Is it a slow news day or not? If it's a slow news day, things get more coverage. If it's not a slow news day. So Rick is in the BSA meeting announcing his resignation when all the reporters in the room start getting up and leaving. And I was a little incensed at them and that. Turns out it was 9/11. The plane had just hit the tower in New York. So it was the non-slow news day of all non-slow news days, and his resignation didn't quite get the coverage that he was thinking it might. After that, I moved into what became called the Center for Global Health, which sort of morphed out of the Office of International Affairs. And I spent a couple years there before I realized that I wasn't too invested to get out of there. And so I did, and I'm now the president and CEO of Synergene Therapeutics, which is a small biotech company that's developing nanomedicines for cancer and other indications. And I also formed a thing I called Capacity Building for Innovation and Transformation, where I developed a set of educational modules on global cancer control for the NCI. These slide sets have now become buried in the rubble of the Center for Global Health, and I'm not exactly sure what's going to become of them, but I'm going to try to, in some way, resurrect them, and maybe some of you might be interested in them as well. I'm going to talk, Bob Chamberlain talked to you a little bit about how to write a paper. I'm going to describe why bother to write a paper. And in order to talk about publications, and again, this is not intended to toot my own horn, but I wanted to give you some idea of for credibility. So my own training, as I said, is biochemistry, cell biology, molecular biology. I've published about 150 papers of one kind and another, book chapters or something, in many what are called high impact factor journals, Science, Nature, Lancet, various things. I also served as series editor for a book series called Modern Cell Biology, and as an editor of one book in that. And if you edit a book, what you do is recruit other people to donate chapters to the book, and it's a little bit like herding cats. You have to kind of try to get all these authors to get their chapters in on time and that sort of stuff. So I did post-transcriptional gene regulation within modern cell biology. And then I also edited current protocols in cell biology and a book called Short Protocols in Cell Biology. And those are both cookbooks, basically. So if you want to know how to culture a cell, you can go and look up cell culture, and it'll tell you to take this media and that dish and one thing and another. So they're basically big cookbooks for the lab. I've held senior administrative management positions at the NCI, as I mentioned, in 2 biotech companies, including the one I'm working at now. I've gotten grants, mainly SBIR grants, also recently a DoD contract to work on nerve agent countermeasures, kind of a little bit off there, but hot topic, as they say in the UK. I'm doing this thing for Synergene, and then CBIT I mentioned. So all of this writing and editing and things like that give me, I think, some perspective on this. And as Amr said yesterday, I sort of think that your CV, your publication list, is your currency. It's going to be the thing that's probably more important than almost anything else in determining what job you can compete for or not. I think if Amr were to be asked to list his most productive students, and he made that list in rank order, that there would probably be some correlation between how well those people got their stuff published and his view of them. So I was trying to think of a way to incentivize you to really care about writing papers and publishing. And so I say that publishing is the key to immortality. And it's also the key to a scientific career along the way to immortality. And I base this, this is my little logo for CBIT. Doesn't it look transformational and innovative? Okay. One has to do what one has to do. This idea of being immortal through publication is actually an ancient Egyptian concept. So in honor of Amr, The Egyptians strove for immortality by internalizing two elements, their identity and their name. And the most cruel punishment, you'll see it if you travel to Egypt, that one can do to a person is to go along and scratch their name off of whatever they've put it on. Okay, because you're attacking their immortality. And so Ramses II left more monuments bearing his name and likeness than any other Egyptian ruler. And scientific publishing gives you the same thing that Ramses got by putting his name on a stone. It's going to be there as long as databases and computers and whatnot exist. You know, when the world lies in ash and rubble and the world is destroyed, the publications won't mean much at that point. But in the meantime, you know, you can achieve something as approaching immortality by publishing. The first Nobel Prize winner that I'll mention is Bob Dylan, who said, "He who is not busy being born is busy dying." And you've heard publish or perish, and in the scientific world that's true, but if you never published and you perish, then it isn't very long before your name or likeness is no more. The ancient Egyptians recognized over 200 illnesses, some of which were tumors, swellings they called them. And another Arab medical person wrote quite extensively, including on breast cancer, around this first Eber's papyrus that's shown there. That's 1500 BC, is about the time of the Hebrew prophet Moses. So that goes back quite a ways. This other fellow lived about 2,500 years later, and he described breast cancer. He also described love as a mental illness, which has recently been confirmed using brain imaging. And the point is that we know all of this because they published it. Okay? If he had thought love was a mental illness and had never written it down, then he wouldn't be getting the credit here, immortal, 1,000 years later. In terms of the history of scientific journals, I start with Gutenberg Bible, a semi-scientific journal. That was 1455, and that's really a big, obviously in publishing in general, movable type, and the way to achieve mass distribution was important. The first scientific journals actually appeared about 200 years later in France and England, and largely due to papers written by Louis Pasteur, papers fall into what is referred to as IMRAD. The model of a paper that Bob described is referred to as IMRAD, which stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Okay, and that's, if you look at all scientific papers, they tend more or less to include those elements and more or less in that order. And as Bob mentioned, there are legitimate and illegitimate journals, but by one count, there are something like 10,000 to 20,000 peer-reviewed scientific journals at present. And with open access and web-based journals, it's gotten even more proliferative. The second Nobel Prize winner I'll mention is Peyton Rouse. Peyton Rouse holds the record for the longest time between his work and his Nobel Prize. So he did the work in 1911. He got the Nobel Prize in 1966. So the trick there, if you're going to beat that record, is you have to do your work very young, which all of you are there. But the other thing is you have to live a long time, because they will only give the Nobel Prize to people who are still alive. So Peyton Rouse did his work when he was about 30, and then he lived to be 90. So he eventually held on long enough for them to recognize that this paper, which had the great title, A Sarcoma of the Fowl, Transmissible by an Agent Separable from the Tumor Cells. So this was the first description of a tumor virus, what is referred to as the Rous sarcoma virus. And so Peyton Rous, had he not published his paper in 1911, from his work done at the Rockefeller, very near here in New York City, then no one would have known about the Rous sarcoma virus 55, 56 years later to make him immortal in that way. The second Nobel Prize winners I'll mention that are immortal are Watson and Crick. And in 1953, they published a paper on the discovery, or the description. It wasn't, to say you discovered DNA, it's kind of presumptuous, but you described the structure of DNA. And this paper contains two of the most significant understatements in the history of science writing. And that's one of the things. You can be subtle or you can be blatant in your writing, and Watson and Crick took the subtle approach. So they said this structure that they were describing has novel features which are of considerable biological interest. And toward the end of the paper, they said, it has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material. It has not escaped their notice that that was true. They were actually willing to almost kill to get this paper out ahead of everybody else, but when they wrote it, they said, it's not escaped our notice. They knew from the beginning that this was important, but they chose a more subtle way of writing. This is Paul Ehrlich. When I was, someone had said in their talk, maybe it was Joan, who said, read, read, read. Okay, I'm going to take the, I'm not going to say don't read. But when I was a biochemistry graduate student, my mentor came to me and he said, all biochemists can be separated into two groups. Those who keep up with the literature and those who contribute to it. Okay? Because when I first came to the NCI, or NIH, I wasn't at the NCI, they used to publish what was called a yellow sheet. And so every week, there would be dozens and dozens of very famous people coming to the NIH to give seminars. And when I first came there, I looked at this yellow sheet. I spent all my time in seminars listening to these talks. And then at one point, a light bulb went on and said, if I keep doing this, I'm never going to be able to give a seminar because I won't have accomplished anything other than listen to somebody else talk about their work. And so it's okay to read, and you obviously have to read because it's the basis of your thing, but if you spend all your time reading or all your time going to seminars, you wouldn't be writing and you wouldn't be doing your own work. So that balance between reading and writing has to be maintained. Ehrlich used in his office the same system I use, which is a very organized piling system. No files are involved, but piles. And because research and publications and funding and the advancement of your career are all intertwined. So research leads to publications, which leads to funding, which can fund research, and your career advancement occurs as a result of that. And this is true in almost every, whether you go to Europe or Japan or now into China. There are a few exceptions to this, and some of them are countries where a research culture isn't very common. And they use, instead of a meritocracy based on your publications, they use what I call the escalator system for career advancement. You get on the bottom of the escalator, there's a group of people in front of you, and if you just stand there and do nothing, the escalator moves till eventually you're at the top. And so in some countries, the chairman of the department is only the person who's been on the escalator the longest before he gets off and someone else takes his place behind him. But that isn't how it works in the US and Europe and most places. There it's a meritocracy. And the merit that they use as currency is your papers. So there's all kinds, you can be diverse in your writing. There's all sorts of papers, not just original research papers, short communications, letter to the editor, case reports, review articles, editorials, commentaries, book reviews, abstracts for meetings. You know, all of these things count as writing. Some count more than others, obviously. But I think getting your toe in the water in writing and continuing to realize that that's an important component of your career advancement, likely funding and all that is important, I think. This is a quote: "Nothing does more to further your career than publication. Publications say that you're serious about research and that you can take a scientific process from beginning to end." Okay. Bob mentioned the other day, and it's true, that, and this is the quote that backs up what he was saying, maybe he derived it from this: if a work is not published, then it was not done. When unpublished, the research goes unnoticed, there's no definite result of the work, your thesis is not an adequate final publication product, as important as it is. The data in your thesis, if it's not published in a journal, is going to sit in the University of Michigan library, and almost no one has access to it. Research can't build on research without publication. The old question: if a tree falls in the forest and there's no sound to hear it, no creature to hear it, does it make a sound? And research that's done, brilliant research that falls in the forest with no one to hear it, doesn't make a sound. So the requirements for and results of research are, it turns out that research requires researchers. And that's one of the reasons why this program is so valuable, is that it's building you as a cadre of researchers. I'll show you some data also, but research is enhanced by global collaboration. Research requires resources. We've heard several people talk about grant writing. It's quite akin in many ways to paper writing, but it has its own form of art that you need to also learn, and research results in publications, as I indicated. This is a quote I like: "Technology alone is not a magic bullet. Existing technologies can be adapted when necessary. New technologies can be invented when indicated, but the key to scientific research resides in human resources." And one of the things that you guys can contribute to this effort globally is your assistance, and we heard something about this just this afternoon, your assistance of people in the countries that you're working in terms of building their own career and capacity for research. Not all career choices are created equal. When was the last time you needed a typewriter repair person? Okay, the technology has moved on. It used to be a legitimate thing to be. I'm a repairman of typewriters. Okay, I make buggy whips. I shoe horses. You know, all of these were legitimate activities. My grandfather actually was a blacksmith who shoed horses, but Gretzky, the Washington Caps won the Stanley Cup. Has everyone heard that? Right? And so the greatest hockey player of all time said, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." And anticipation in science pays off, as it does in ice hockey. Immunotherapy for cancer is now, you know, the hot button item. Had you trained in immunotherapy in cancer a dozen years ago, you'd be a hot property right now. You know, jobs they'd be beating a path to your door to try to give you a job. So being able to try and anticipate what fields are going to be hot in the future is what Gretzky has. And actually Steve Jobs of Apple used this quote a lot as he described the technology of creating Apple as a company. The idea that everyone would not have a mainframe that fills this room, but our own personal computer. Pretty radical at the time, but it turned out to be quite prescient. And we now give credit to all the young people who are digitally savvy. But if it weren't for people skating to where the puck is going to be, they wouldn't have anything to play with. Now, this is an interesting bit of statistics. This is looking at the doctorate level holders employed in academia, doesn't include industry, by birthplace. In 1973, 11.7% of those individuals were foreign born. And by 2015, the number had risen to 29.5%. And if you actually look at this by position, at the postdoc level, which are the people who are entering the scientific world, 50% of them in the United States are now foreign born. This is data from the NSF. So despite what you may hear coming out of Washington, America remains a land of opportunity for immigrants. And many of you might be foreign born. I was born in Ohio, so. Collaborations. Okay, this is a quote from the Journal of Higher Education, which is sort of related to the ACE that Joe was talking about. Productivity is positively correlated with collaboration with faculty members outside a scientist university, and to a lesser degree with faculty members inside the home department. So if you're looking for collaborators, the person who's in the lab next to you is handy, but it doesn't broaden your horizon and it doesn't move your collaboration forward nearly as significantly. And again, this is based on bibliometric analysis as collaboration with faculty members outside your university. So cultivate and nurture collaborations, but focus on those that work well. I know Bob said never lose a phone number, but I'm going to say dump the collaborations that don't work, okay? You got no time to hang out with people who you don't get along with and who the collaboration's not working. So knock the dust off your sandals and look for somebody else to work with. Mentoring was mentioned, and mentoring in writing papers is very important. The mentor who says, write your paper and we'll submit it, I don't really need to read it that carefully, is not the mentor that you want. You want a mentor that cares about the quality of your writing and your publication, who can give you feedback and help you to become a better writer. I said I was going to take exception with don't read to the absence of write, but you do need to read the papers that are in the literature of your field so that you know what's out there, because you need to write an introduction and a discussion that places what you've done in the context of the field. And I've always been crazy about journal clubs, where somebody else does the work of reading and digesting the paper, and one time out of 10 it's you, but you go to there and you hear about these papers and you see how the work has been done and that sort of thing. We used to have an interesting thing, this will date me, there was a thing called a carousel projector. Okay, you don't want to be a carousel projector repairman either. Okay, but the carousel projector held a carousel that held slides. And one of the things that we used to do when I was a graduate student was everyone had to prepare 10 slides that described a research project that they were working on from start to finish. A self-contained slide of 10. We put them in the carousel and then we played Russian roulette. You had to take someone else's slides and describe their project on the fly. And it was quite an interesting exercise. Another one that someone mentions, the Statman Award, right? Earl Statman, who was an NIH person. He became blind in his later years, and they had a Statman lecture, which the only requirement was you couldn't use any slides whatsoever. You had to come and describe your research so that a blind person could understand it. And again, it's an exercise that hones certain skills that I think are useful even for the sighted. Write papers that address the questions that people have. And the questions are actually quite simple. Who, what, where, when, why, how. And papers tend to address those. I have on here, make your paper as short as possible, but no shorter than possible. Bob said yesterday that an editor once suggested he divide a paper into 3 parts. We used to have, in the lab that I worked in, we had what was what we called an LPU, least publishable unit. Okay, it was the least work you could do that could be turned into a paper. Because if you follow the LPU model, it's not necessarily for everything, but it gives you more papers. You're not writing big long papers that have 18 figures, you're writing 3 papers that each have 6. And if it makes sense to break up a paper, you get a lot more credit for 3 papers that have 6 figures each than for 1 paper that has 18 figures in that currency thing. Not all figures are created equal. And realize that the main question of the reviewer is not who, what, when, where, how, what, you did all this, but what's wrong with this picture. Reviewers, rightly or wrongly, whether they're grant reviewers or paper reviewers, think it's their job to find something wrong with what you've written. That's how they function. That's how they operate. That's their mentality. What's wrong with this picture? Because it shows, if they can find what's wrong with the picture, then it shows they're doing their job. Now, no one has talked about doing work on bibliometric analysis as part of you're working on populations and that. But there are some questions that you can answer because there's a big database. You guys are used to patient databases and one thing and another. But the biggest database that's out there is like PubMed and databases like that have these 10 or 20,000 journals represented. So if you wanted to know what countries or regions of the world are on the rise in science generally, or in any given particular field, cancer immunotherapy, you could address that question bibliometrically. How many productive collaborations, either South-South or North-South, are going on? The answer is in the PubMed. What scientific areas are those collaborations, international collaborations, occurring? The answer is in PubMed. Who's collaborating with whom? Gets down to the individuals in PubMed. And so if you can imagine how difficult these questions would be to answer by designing some sort of survey tool, and how much crap you would get back from the answers of such a survey tool, because it would depend on who you sent it to and whether they answered. But you can address them all bibliometrically. So here's an example. If you look at total publications by country, you see that the headline in Nature in January of this year was, China passes the US in terms of scientific papers. So in 2016, China became the primary publisher of scientific papers. We can get into how much is spent on science and that sort of thing, but I won't. It's even more dramatic if you look at the share of scientific papers. So the blue line that's sort of falling halfway down, I don't know whether this works or not. Is this a laser? Yeah. So this is the US share of publications, and this is China and other developing countries on the rise as part of publications. There's no way you could ever know this unless someone had analyzed the PubMed database in order to give you that. You might guess that might be true, but India is slightly on the rise. But look, India and China are about the same size, and India is so far behind China in terms of publications that it's they're not even close. And so this is an example of a country that's really put the emphasis on science and engineering and training, and also clearly someone over there is stressing the importance of writing papers as the currency. Collaborations. This is some NSF data from 2006 and 2016. It's looking at multi-institutional authorship. And again, 60% of all papers in 2006 included multiple institutional authorship, and that's up a little bit by 2016. Multiple domestic-only institutional authorship actually falls a little bit in this decade, but the biggest increase percentage-wise is in multi-international collaborations. Okay, so you guys are right at the forefront of that. You have all these contacts and things that you can write with, and you get a lot more credit for a paper that has multiple authors from multiple countries than you do if everyone there is your brother or sister in your own family. This is a very interesting analysis that, again, is bibliometric. It's looking at all the countries of Africa and connecting lines for where they've published papers together. Okay, I actually included this it was originally published by these folks, but in a Lancet article I wrote, I have this as one of the supplemental figures. And it tells you quite a bit. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Look at this. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia never collaborate with anyone other than themselves. Okay? Within Africa. So again, the French language is probably the biggest explanation for that. South Africa is the most collaborative of countries. The density of these lines tells you. So Egypt collaborates with North Africa with almost no one else in Africa except South Africa, okay, in this analysis. And Africa sort of divides into regions that you can see here, 4 regions that tend to collaborate within themselves more than they collaborate outside themselves. So again, we could spend a lot of time looking at it, and we won't, but it is an interesting way of doing a bibliometric analysis to answer the question, who's collaborating with whom? If you want to, this is another analysis where, again, 6 countries of Africa looked at who their papers are with. In Algeria and Tunisia, the main partner is France. Again, the language comes to the fore, not surprising. In all the other 4, the USA is the top collaborative country from outside of Africa. UK is usually pretty high. It's kind of interesting. Egypt is right across the water from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt have a fair amount of collaboration going on scientifically. But again, I'm only stressing the fact that the PubMed database has a lot of information in it about international collaborations that you might want to look at if you were so inclined. There have been people who've written about what the barriers to research and barriers to publication are, and I think it's useful because these barriers need to be overcome. So barriers to research, not surprisingly, lack of research funding, poor facilities, limited technical support, little available training, few tutors or mentors, weak peer networks, and diffuse relation between researchers and academic reward. That's that escalator system that I talked about. Barriers to publication, English language is an obstacle, uncertainty about journal options, Bob talked a little bit about that, no culture of publication to draw upon, either projects your donor or your ministry wants you to do compete with your writing time, and another one here is fear of rejection. Some people are paralyzed by the fear of rejection to the point where they'd rather not submit a paper than to run the risk of it being rejected. Bob talked a little bit about choice of journal, and these are the so-called impact factor. There's a lot of debate about impact factor, and impact factor does not say anything about the importance of a given paper. It talks about the number of citations that the journal has received over the past 2 years. So the top journal on this list is New England Journal of Medicine. You can see that a lot of the ones up at the top are general journals that have both biochemistry and cell biology and medicine and physics and chemistry and who knows what in it, like Science and Nature and Lancet, etc. But there are some cancer journals that hit pretty high on the list, and Cell is up there, and you come down. But again, this is not to say that publishing a paper in Cell and Molecular Biology isn't a good thing, and it might be an extremely important paper. It just says that the Cell and Molecular Biology papers, over the last 2 years, the papers published in that journal have had fewer citations elsewhere, 70 times fewer, than the New England Journal of Medicine. So you want to try and, move your way up this scale. In some cases, promotions and hires and things like that actually analyze your CV by impact factor. I'm not completely convinced it's a legitimate tool to use in that way, but it is done. The best way to assess whether a given journal is suitable for your paper is to look at what they've published. Bob mentioned that the other day. If they're not publishing papers anything like what you're writing, your chances of being in there are not high. Persistence, Amr stressed persistence in other ways, but persistence in this, someone mentioned, do I need a plan B for my paper? Answer, yes. You need a plan B, C, D, however long it takes. So it turns out that it's okay to aim high unless you're being unrealistic. If you have a mundane pedestrian paper and you write it for Science and send it to them, they reject 90% of what they get. So it might be an exercise in futility of sorts unless you really think it has a shot. But I pointed this out yesterday, over 90% of the submissions to Science are rejected, but 70% of those rejects eventually get published somewhere else. Okay, so it's not like being rejected from Science is the end of it, but you can save some time if the paper is just blatantly not of Science material based on what Science, you can read in Science what they publish. So the pro tip, Grasshopper, is choose your journal wisely, but do not give up after rejection. And I found this Schultz cartoon where Snoopy gets a letter. It says, "Dear contributor, thank you for submitting your story to our magazine. To save time, we're enclosing 2 rejection slips, one for this story and one for your next one." Okay, and rejection happens. We all get rejected, so you can't be paralyzed by the fear of rejection. But, and I love this, you run the gauntlet here, and this is what reviewers feel is their job, to whack you as you go by. And if you can get by them all, you can get the paper published. Reviewers tend to think, as I said, that they've not done their job if they don't find fault with either the work or the writing or both. But there also is a way to address reviewers, either by resubmitting to that same journal or by taking their comments into account. It's rare that you get a situation where the reviewer says something that's completely out of left field. You might not agree with it, but if your writing hasn't made a certain point clear to them and they bring it up to you, you'd be silly to say, well, I don't agree with that, I'm going to resubmit it somewhere and I'm not even going to take that comment into account. So even negative reviews can be helpful in reshaping the manuscript. And in some cases, when you resubmit, you have to adopt a certain language. Like, you never write back and say, these reviewers are bozos and they're out to lunch. You say, we've carefully considered the remarks made by the reviewers, and while we take exception to some of them, we have modified the paper in the following way. And most journals require that you, if you resubmit, that you actually send them the list of the changes that you made, highlighted out or something. So the final take-home lesson is take your shots. The other Gretzky quote is, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Okay? So 100% of papers not submitted are not published. 100% of grants not applied for are not funded. Your chances of finding the winning mega lottery ticket laying on the street is actually higher than getting a grant funded that you didn't submit. Okay? And 100% of job non-applicants are not hired. Okay? So you have to be willing to take your shots and see where it goes. And I think that's all I have. And you can email me if you have any questions about any of this. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg on publishing, but nonetheless, I hope it's helpful. Thanks.
Questions, comments?
I didn't mention it yesterday, but I think it doesn't work. Where's the expert? So care in writing is something that I didn't mention yesterday. But journals typically use computer programs to identify plagiarized parts of a manuscript. So it's very useful for you to track your citations within your paper. And a paper that goes through several iterations of drafts and modifications, sometimes the citations get dropped or get lost. And I just can tell you that if you have submitted a paper that the computer program like Turn It In will turn yellow and red, is not one that you'll be able to resubmit to that journal even after you've fixed it, because the editor will consider you a sloppy writer, or worse, a criminal.
That's a fun topic. Dr. Solomon wants me to comment on plagiarism. I have not committed any, but I will admit. No. I haven't been caught. There's a big difference.
Catching comes before hanging.
Yeah. So I've served as the journal editor for Journal of Cancer Education, and before me was Joe O'Donnell. And I've been doing it for, finishing my 6th year of a 5-year contract. And we've only had one serious case of plagiarism, which occurred about a year ago, in which it was brought to our attention by a reader who says, hey, I read this article in your journal, and it bears a striking similarity to mine. And he attached his article, and I read them both, and I said, I'll be damned. Yeah, this is plagiarism. A lot of journals don't have a policy, or if they have a policy, it doesn't have much teeth. What can they do? Well, obviously, they'll withdraw it, and there'll be a public proclamation. But oftentimes, and this is from my other life, when I served as the officer for responsible conduct of research at the Roswell Park, which means we were the ethics cops. So if someone got blown in, it ended up on my desk. and we had to go through the adjudication process. And one of our investigators found an investigator from another institution and plagiarized his paper. When you go after the journals, most of the journals say, hey, thanks for bringing it to our attention, we'll review it and we'll retract it. Not much more we can do. Go to his or her home institution and proceed there. And that's what eventually you do. The person who's been harmed will bring it to the attention of the individual's home institution, and then they will initiate an investigation. That initiation, if it was found that the individual did plagiarize, and if they were working on research that was funded by federal dollars, has to be reported to the group in Washington at the NIH. They can take additional sanctions. So your home institution, with plagiarism, unfortunately, they may slap you on the wrist because you'll probably plead, I lost it. I was going to cite it. Now, when it happens 8 or 9 or 10 times in an article, it's tough to use that ruse. Some people will. Your home institution, very few people get fired for plagiarism. We fired somebody at our institution, but it happens, but it's rare. But if it goes to Washington and you're found guilty, there are certain penalties. You can get a slap on the wrist, which might be you can't apply for funds for 1 year. Or maybe it's you can't apply for funds for 5 years. Or maybe it's you can never apply for funds. But even if it's for 5 years, your career is screwed. Because your lab is shut down for 5 years without federal money. I mean, these are serious situations. And stealing someone's thoughts is really pretty heinous when you think about it. You wouldn't want people stealing your ideas, so you should properly cite other people's ideas.
There is another feature of plagiarism that's kind of interesting, which is self-plagiarism. I once got a paper to review for biochemistry, and as I often do, I had sort of a deja vu as I was reading it, because I had read almost the same paper in JBC, Journal of Biological Chemistry, by the same authors earlier in the year. And when I actually compared the two papers, you know, there were like 4 or 5 of the actual data figures that had been published in the JBC article that were now being published in biochemistry. It's all right to repeat a figure in a review article or something like that, but where if the journals are expecting primary data, having 4 or 5 of your figures published more than once is considered a no-no as well. And you're not stealing someone else's thought. I have a little bit of more trouble with verbiage that I used before coming out again and being referred to as plagiarism, because I have certain ways of saying something that I may say it again without there. But these programs that Bob's talking about might flag up the way I've said a certain thing in more than one paper. I think that's sort of marginal, but certainly the primary data being published more than once is considered a sin. Yes, back here. There's a question.
So you talked about plagiarism. What are your thoughts on duplication of the study and results exactly the same with the same database, coming to the same conclusion? So I faced it recently. So I published a paper on my topic of interest, and someone else published it with the same database. CDC has National Readmission Database, which is part of the HCUP, and some other journal published it, but there was a third paper which came out of it, and I happened to be the reviewer of the third paper, which is exactly the same. And I wrote to the editor, I gave my frank comment as a reviewer. It's a great topic, but I don't see anything novel in it because there are already 3 publications out of it. And I've recommended as a rejection, and I gave my frank comments. So this is a novel topic. But the editor is kind of a senior editor, and he knows the senior author of the third paper which is going to be published. So what do you do in that kind of situation? It's a duplication, not exactly plagiarism?
Yeah, I think if two groups independently decide to analyze the database to answer a given question, and they don't know the other group exists, or they do even, and they do their work independently, and they come up with the same conclusion, that's certainly not plagiarism. And you don't have the same, I mean, with a patent, there are laws about first to publish and first to invent and all this sort of stuff that has to do with, you know, commercializing a product from it. But if it's a study on the relationship between pancreatitis and pancreatic cancer, and two people have analyzed the same database and published it and got the same results, I think you should be happy about that. It confirms the work that you've done. And I wouldn't call that plagiarism. Now, and if they're reasonably contemporaneous, you can't blame them for not knowing about your work or vice versa. If time has passed and a reasonable person in the field should know about your paper and just chooses not to cite it, you know, I think that's a different, again, it's not plagiarism, but it's a failure on their part to do the right thing. I don't know if that addresses your question. Once the two papers are out there, the idea of someone coming along and doing it again for the third time, obviously they're not going to be able to submit that to a high impact factor journal because it's not news anymore. But I think a little bit of the plagiarism, I think, should have intent as a part of its analysis. You know, if you intended to steal someone's ideas or you intended to publish the same thing twice, but doing an independent study and finding the same thing happens all the time. And in fact, people at the NIH have been questioned by Congress before, why are you funding so much redundant research? If you've got somebody looking at the relationship between pancreatitis and pancreatic cancer at Hopkins, why the hell would you fund a second grant at UCLA looking at the same thing? Aren't you wasting federal funds or something? But it's because they don't understand how science works. And the idea of competition and trying to be the first to get something published is a part of the thing that keeps it going. It's like, why don't we play basketball and not keep score? Or why don't we, you know, the competition drives the process to some degree. And knowing that someone else is working on a particular thing and you're working on it, I mentioned Watson and Crick. There was a tremendous race to come up with the DNA structure. Linus Pauling was involved and other people. And there were actually some ethically questionable things that took place during that race in order to try and be the first to come up with a DNA structure, or someone looked at someone's X-ray drawings and figured out something that, you know, without giving them credit for that, you know, and one thing and another. So there's all these stories that happen when something turns out to be famous. My wife was one of two labs that discovered that P53 was the inherited defect in Lee-Fromeni syndrome. Lee-Fromeni syndrome is a cancer-prone familial cancer, where people get cancers of all different kinds, early onset. And Joe Fromeni, who used to be the head of DCEG, and Fred Lee described this, and their name is associated with it. And two labs simultaneously were working on Lee-Fromeni samples and discovered that it was an inherited defect in P53 that was the basis for this disorder. One published a paper in Nature and the other one in Science within like a week of one another. And you know, again, it was, in that case, it was not plagiarism, it was competition, it was race to the answer, and it was confirming that they both found the same thing. And one became the most cited paper from Science in that year, and the other was the most cited paper in Nature in that year. So I think competition is to be welcomed because it drives you to be better. And you just have to, follow the golden rule that, not do things that you wouldn't want done to you.
Well, it's not outright plagiarism. It's sometimes very sloppy scholarship when you've taken the shortcut and looked at a recently published work related to your area, and you've captured a lot of the background from that paper, and in your own words, you've incorporated into your paper. But I'm reminded of a couple of situations where that shortcut should have been augmented by digging deeper into the original sources, because the recent scientific paper, the author had misinterpreted what the original sources actually said. And letters to the editor from some of the original sources essentially said, I didn't say that in my paper. Someone along the way made a mistake about what I had actually said, and then multiple other papers adopted that interpretation.
Propagation of the error.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think that, I agree with you. I wouldn't call that plagiarism either. I would call it sloppiness. And any other comments or questions? If not, I'll give it back to Amr. Oh, yeah, back there.
I just follow up with your idea about, like, in addition to the ideas of competition, I think it's also about reproducible. So, for example, it's a very novel idea. It's good to have different labs to do similar thing to confirm it, so it's reproducible.
Yeah. I mean, if you had any doubt that P53 was the defect, having two papers come out simultaneously with that conclusion made both of them stronger.